At the end of the day, both the Israeli government and the Israeli electorate do not want peace. They want to take more land. That's just a fact, okay? And it's a fact based on the polling, it's a fact based on the elections. They don't want peace. We have to make them want peace, not through violence, but through leverage, power, etc. It doesn't help to be anti-Semitic, that takes away your leverage. It doesn't help to be extremist or maximalist, it takes away your leverage and your power. But ultimately, Ahmed, if we have a disagreement, it's on this. The responsibility doesn't lie with the Palestinians. I would ask them to do the right thing anyway, but the responsibility much more so. Responsibility lies on all sides, of course, as a general thing. But who has the bigger responsibility? It's the people with power. It's the people doing the occupation. It's the people doing the oppression. It's the people that have slaughtered over 50,000 people and 15,000 children that are currently stealing more land in Gaza. And yes, they are stealing it. That's exactly what's happening. All right, you guys ready to solve the Palestine-Israel issue? Well, let's give it a shot. We're gonna bring in Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. He is the leader of Realign for Palestine. And we're gonna find out what that realignment is, whether it can work, whether it's a solution, how do we get it done, who's in the way. We're gonna figure it all out right now. So Ahmed, welcome, thanks for being on, brother, we appreciate it. And start with telling us what Realign for Palestine is.
Well, thanks so much for having me on, really appreciate it. So Realign for Palestine is a project at the Atlantic Council, a nonpartisan think tank and do tank really in Washington, DC, where I'm based. And it's meant to create an organizational framework around some of the ideas that I've been promulgating since the tragedy of October 7th and the horrendous war that ensued in the Gaza Strip, where I grew up and had immediate and extended family members of mine and lost family members of mine. Realign for Palestine is an effort to elevate pragmatic, moderate Palestinian voices who genuinely care about the Palestinian people, who are invested in the rights and the aspirations of the Palestinian people, while also paying attention to ways in which we can adjust the approach of the Palestinian National Project by trying out different approaches, starting with the rejection of violence as something that is not effective. The emphasis on the two-nation solution. We hear about the two-state solution, which for a variety of reasons, it's not viable according to some, to many, because of the settlements, military occupation, Hamas, etc. Nevertheless, the idea of the two-nation solution is that there are two nations, two people with two unique national identities, and that should be the guiding principle for our desired pursuit of a resolution. The embrace of multiple truths, nuance. Yes, I understand people sometimes get triggered when you say it's complicated, because there is a desire to pursue a simplistic narrative, a black and white, oppressed, oppressor approach that, while satisfactory for some people, it actually ends up leaving a lot of meat on the table that's not getting addressed. So multiple truths allows us, as a principle, allows us to say, yes, there's an imbalance of power dynamics between Palestinians and Israelis, but within said imbalance exists, for us as Palestinians, exists a lot of space to acknowledge our shortcomings, to acknowledge our mistakes, to have accountability and agency and responsibility. And that's not to blame the victim or being self-hating. I'm proud of my Palestinian identity. I love the Palestinian people. And finally, by marrying an evolution of the narrative, the pro-Palestine narrative and advocacy, with pro-Palestine policy advocacy and promulgation. So that's ultimately what Realign for Palestine is meant to be. It's a kind of a space, a new third way, if you will, that incorporates multiple truths and hopefully will rejuvenate what it means to be pro-Palestine at a time when it is incredibly polarizing and incredibly toxic for a variety of reasons.
Yeah, so I think we're going to largely agree, but maybe there might be parts we don't. I want to probe more into 2 states versus 2 nations. I haven't heard that distinction too much before. I think there is a clear oppressed and oppressors. Maybe we'll get into that. But overall, I agree with you on nuance for sure. Anytime you're not doing nuance, you're not living in the reality-based world. But before we get to any of that, so how many family members have you lost in Gaza?
So I've lost, unfortunately, that's part of what put me on the map, 33 of my immediate and extended family members. My childhood home, the house that I grew up in Gaza City. I left Gaza when I was 15. I'm 34 right now. And I left and I came here by myself as an exchange student to the United States, was supposed to go back to the Gaza Strip, but was unable to enter due to Hamas's control of the Gaza Strip. And I ultimately received asylum in the United States. I was stuck at the borders in Egypt, unable to go through the infamous Rafah border crossing. And so my dad he passed away 5 years ago, but he was the director of he was an UNRWA doctor. He ran the clinic in the Jabalia refugee camp up north. My oldest brother is there as we speak right now. He runs a major British international medical NGO. I got his brother I got his wife, and 4 children out. I got my mom out. I have a sister that left and is in Jerusalem, a sister in the UAE, and my other brother who ran the UNRWA beach refugee camp clinic. He left and is now in Germany. And so there were 3 separate airstrikes that, and with one in particular that killed 29 people on December 14th, 2023. That was exceptionally deadly. And the New York Times did an investigation, and Amnesty International asked questions, Foreign Policy Magazine asked questions, and the IDF never responded as to what happened and what took place. And I've my 12-year-old niece Farah was killed in this and was survived by her twin sister Mara, who was badly disabled. My first cousin Isra, was thrown out of a building and then crushed by a concrete slab that fell on her and became quadriplegic. And many other family members who suffered. My uncle Muhammad, right before this ceasefire, just earlier in January, a week before the ceasefire, he lost his life in a market in northern Gaza. My uncle Ibrahim, he was in northern Gaza, and he basically had to, he at one point during the war, during the 18-month war, was the only person remaining in our neighborhood in northern Gaza. And there were bodies all over the place. And he turned one of our neighbors, our next door neighbor's front yard into a makeshift cemetery. And he was literally just dragging bodies and just burying them in there. So I know a thing or two about loss, and and everybody in Gaza has suffered, but I decided that I want to honor the legacy of my fallen family members by doing something that does break away from the vicious cycle of this violence. And I'm not saying that as a cute talking point or as something that, I just think sounds nice, but I haven't thought through. I actually connected with hostage families, with survivors of October 7th, with families of current hostages, and with released and former hostages, and tried to establish common ground in our sorrow and our tragedy. And while that's difficult and challenging, that was an exercise in empathy and humanity that showed me the power of healing and reconciliation at a human level in overcoming and transcending this suffering that unfortunately a lot of folks don't want to talk about ways to overcome. That's my remark about the oppressed oppressor. Of course, I understand that the Palestinian people have been oppressed and have lost a lot of their rights, just as they've also been at the receiving end of terrible leadership from Hamas, from the Arab governments and Muslim countries, historically and contemporarily. And we can certainly talk about that. But that was what I was referring to.
Yeah, I'm going to get to Hamas in a sec. But look, I don't have any particular feelings about Norway. I guess I'm slightly positive towards it, right? It seems like a lovely country. And I knew one beautiful person from Norway who was great to me. But if Norway had killed 33 members of my family, I think I'd be within my rights to despise them. So I'm curious, just on a personal level, how do you get past that? How do you not despise Israel?
Well, I'm angry. I'm furious. I'm upset. I'm called to action. I have choice words for Netanyahu. I have said that I believe Mr. Netanyahu is a war criminal. I have regularly criticized the conduct of the Israeli government and military in the Gaza Strip. But that is different than being hateful. And I work really hard at this. I've engaged in a lot of mindfulness exercises. I've engaged in a lot of spiritual exercises to try and maintain an internal sense of balance and an internal sense of well-being that sustains me. But the other thing too is that because of the massive, massive amount of loss in the Gaza Strip, I do worry immensely about the ramifications of this for generations to come. And so I want to lead by example in saying that we should not hate, we should not use this as motivation to become cannon fodder in yet another useless war or more recruitment ads for Hamas or other terror organizations. And to me, that feels like, once again, a meaningful way of honoring the legacy of my fallen family members, the ones that I grew up with, the ones that I remember vividly, and I feel their presence. And when my brother went to collect their remains from underneath the rubble, which, by the way, my brother and his 4 children and wife that I helped get out from Gaza, they were in our family home on October 13th, 2023, when it was bombed by the Israeli Air Force. And they pushed their way out of the rubble and they survived that. And so the near death experience there is why I felt really strongly about trying to save what I can of what remains of my family. But going back to your point, I want to act upon my privilege, being an American, being somebody who's both removed but not removed from it. I'm constantly in touch with it and have been in constant contact with Gaza because I worry about that 50% of Gazans are under the age of 18. Yeah. Imagine all the trauma that those children have gone through. Imagine the horror and the suffering of all the children that lost their parents and all the young men that may one day want to avenge the loss of their siblings, their parents. I don't want the people of Gaza, the beautiful people of Gaza that I remember. I don't want the potentiality of my people to go from nation building to vengeance and death and more bloodshed.
Yeah. So before we get to constructive solutions and trying to figure out how to fix this thing, I want to ask you one more personal question, but just I want people to understand. I totally agree with what you're saying. Hate can't drive out hate. Only love can. Martin Luther King Jr. said that, and it's totally true. If all we do is we hate the Israelis, it's not going to solve the problem. The hatred is the source of the problem, right? So, but it's easier for me to say because I didn't lose 33 family members. So, and it's easy for me to say because I don't live in Gaza and I didn't have to go through what they went through. So I think if Israel was trying to get to long-term peace, they chose a very curious path to do that. I mean, they've probably radicalized hundreds of thousands of Palestinians through that bombing campaign. It's deeply, deeply counterproductive to Israel being a safe haven for Jews. So, okay, one last personal thing though. So you were stopped at the Rafah border crossing because of Hamas, you said. Why? Why did they know to stop you? What happened there?
Well, what happened is that Hamas abducted Gilad Shalit, a young Israeli soldier, in 2006. It was, I would argue it was a very, very miniaturized October 7th. I was in Egypt about to cross into Gaza. They didn't stop me. There was a European police mission that was operating the border in between on the Palestinian side, and then there was the Egyptian side. But then Hamas abducted Gilad Shalit, a young Israeli soldier. That started a mini war that basically shut down the borders, followed by Hezbollah's own attack in the north that abducted the bodies of 4 Israeli soldiers up north. And there was a 2-front war simultaneously in the summer of 2006. And I had no way of going back into Gaza. Plus, the program I had participated in a Palestinian, it was a post 9/11 initiative called the YES program, Youth Exchange and Study Program. It was called the Senators Kennedy and Lugar, Richard Lugar of Indiana and Kennedy, who wanted to build cultural bridges between the Arab and Muslim world and the United States by bringing youngsters to live with host families for a year, go to a high school, and then go back to your respective homeland and build a cultural bridge. So I did just that, and I had a near-death experience myself in Gaza as a young man. So when I was 11 in 2001, soon after 9/11, it was in November of 2001, and I've written about this at length in Israeli press and other outlets. I almost lost my life to an Israeli bomb that ended up killing 2 of my friends and rendered me largely deaf in my left ear from a TBI. The concussive blast wave, if you will, caused me hearing loss. And so I was determined to seek a pathway out of Gaza just to try to plant seeds elsewhere in the world.
Yeah.
And 4 years later, I was leaving to the United States. But in a Palestinian context, for a teenager to live with a host family and be abroad for an entire year, there was a lot of suspicion towards the program, and people were like, you're going to become brainwashed, and you're going to be a spy, and you're going to come back with liquor and hookers and drugs and whatever. I don't know. Sorry if that's okay. R-rated. But it's so fine. They very much so kept inciting against the program, and I was in the second cohort. At one point, actually, Hamas used physical force to prevent students from traveling on this program. Ultimately, they ended up folding and allowing it to take place. But my personality, I've always been outspoken. I've always been somebody who does not toe the line. I've never been somebody to take superficial answers without looking for evidence. I've been genuinely thinking critically about solutions for Gaza since the 90s. I caught the tail end of the Oslo process. Gaza had a short-lived airport that I flew into it in 1999 and in 2000. We ditched the Egyptian travel documents, and then we got the Palestinian Authority passport. We got the Palestinian IDs. We got the Palestinian curriculum in Gaza. Gaza has historically had Egyptian influence, and all of a sudden, after Oslo, there was a sense of sovereignty and a resemblance of like statehood. We were headed to becoming a nation, and unfortunately, the second Intifada ended up significantly setting that back. After what took place. And finally, I left 1 month before the withdrawal of Israeli settlements. And I left in July of 2005. The settlements were withdrawn in August of 2005. There was immense optimism that maybe Gaza can become a role model, that maybe Gaza can effectively overcome its challenges now that the settlements were out, and that we can prove to ourselves, to the Arabs, to the world, to the Americans, to the quartet, to the Israelis, to the Jewish world, that we are capable of living side by side to a safe and secure Israel, that we do not seek the annihilation of the Jewish people. And I remember these conversations, Cenk, very vividly. I remember there being like even some Western paid roundtables. I remember brown bag lunches and spaces where we were talking about what are we going to do with the withdrawal. And unfortunately, we know what ended up happening.
Yeah. Yes, but that's also super complicated because Hamas was, terrible. They, really ended democracy, etc. But it's not like Israel ever really gave Gaza sovereignty. They didn't really have sovereignty, and so, and Israel never really gave them a peace offer after the 2008. So it's been 17 years of Israel not wanting peace. So it's complicated. There's no question it's complicated. So, but I'm curious about the two states versus the two nations. What do you mean not two states, but two nations? What does that mean?
Oh, for sure. I mean, the two-state solution is the vehicle through which we realize the two-nation solution. But at its most rudimentary kind of interpretation, the two-nation solution is meant to stave off what I believe is an incredibly irrational kind of move toward not just there's the one state reality, then there's the one state desire. The one state reality is what people feel is going to emerge if you basically end up annexing part of the West Bank, expanding the settlements throughout the West Bank, and the military occupation becomes entrenched. You kill off the Palestinian Authority. You end up with a de facto system that doesn't necessarily give Palestinians equal rights under Israeli law. That's the potential. We're not quite there yet for the one state reality. Certainly, if you move in settlers or if you take over the Gaza Strip, the one state desire there's a certain movement within the pro-Palestine advocacy space, including with Jewish allies, that wants to actually move ahead of this and say, actually, the one state reality is a good thing for both people. One state, two people, equal democratic representation under the law. And that's the end of that. And I think there's just two simple problems. Number one is that I've never personally, and I know a lot of Palestinians in Gaza and folks who are coming from the West Bank, I've never met a Palestinian in the land who will ever even use the word one state solution or the one state idea as a favorable, positive thing. Palestinians, after 76 years of displacement, of occupation, of dispossession, of not having the right to self-determination, if you will, they want a space in which they express their unique national identity. On the other hand, there is never going to be a scenario, and this has been stated ad nauseum by Israeli think tanks, politicians, religious figures. There's not going to be a scenario in which Israel gives up its Jewish demographic majority, which it ultimately would if it de jure absorbs all the Palestinians. So I do think that just because the two-state solution is difficult to implement right now doesn't mean it's what we it's not what we should be calling for and demanding for. And yes, we've talked about territorial swaps. We've talked about different ideas for how to actually make it more viable. But I strongly believe that the two-nation solution reaffirms, kind of takes a step back from the border discussion and simply reaffirms the commitment that there needs to be two separate nations, whereby where relevant, they'll have cooperation, but where needed, and believe me, it's going to be needed, there will be separation. So separation, AKA divorce, and cooperation where needed.
Okay, so first of all, I agree 100% with you on the one-state solution. If it's one state with Greater Israel being the driving force of it, that's what the terrorists inside the Israeli government want, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, Netanyahu. So they want to keep the Palestinians, either drive them through genocide and ethnic cleansing out of the Gaza Strip, out of the West Bank, or keep a portion of them basically as de facto slaves. But in their democracy, they would get no votes at all, and Israel would just basically steal their land. So that's totally untenable. It's the most unjust thing I've ever heard, etc. The one-state solution on the other side, totally untenable. Israel will never agree to having Jews be the minority in a government. And you can say, oh well, if they were, fair and honest, they would, because they claim to be a democracy. It doesn't matter what you think. And it doesn't matter what's fair and honest. They're never, ever going to agree to that. So anyone who thinks that the Israelis are gonna be like, oh yeah, we'll get outvoted, we're totally fine with that. They're living on a totally different planet. And any talk of that is just terribly counterproductive, because it gets us further away from peace, not closer to it. So are you saying that, but between the two states and the two nations, is the difference in your mind the separation? Because I've always been in favor of a two-state solution. I haven't heard it being called a two-nation solution, but sure, two states, two nations, I'm in either way. But is there a real difference between those two terms?
I'll tell you what the real I mean, you might at the end of this laugh and say this is semantics, but honestly, brother, for so many constituencies, and I am in a lot of DC constituencies, Jewish and Israeli constituencies. I'm around a lot of these constituencies who are very pro two-state solution, but they can't even utter the word two-state solution because it is incredibly radioactive in an Israeli geopolitical and just societal context. That's number one. Number two is that for a lot of Palestinians and a lot of their allies, the two-state solution has become represented, unfortunately, by the weak, corrupt, incompetent, incapable Palestinian Authority. And therefore, it has just the two-state solution itself has become so untenable, so mentally untenable to folks that it is difficult for them to even fathom it as even being a part of the discussion. So this is an attempt to take a step back from the traditional framing of it as the two-state solution, because it envisions the 67 borders. And I am humbly saying, I don't know what the final borders will look like, because there's gonna have to be territorial swaps, because there are some of these settlements, these communities in the West Bank, that are going to be like Ariel or Mali Adumim. They're going to be nearly impossible, if not outright impossible, to dismantle and remove.
Put me in, coach.
So they're going to have to be some compromises. So I don't want to get bogged down in the details of what the borders look like, but I want to keep the two-state solution alive. I've heard that from so many different thinkers and folks who are former ambassadors. After talking to Palestinians, after talking to folks who are a part of this thing, and my own personal belief and taking stock of what are the options, it's keeping the two-nation solution is an attempt to keep the two-state solution alive without having to call it the two-state solution.
Okay, I understand. Although that made me a little bit more depressed because so I'm not in the camp of giving up on the two-state solution, and the fact that both sides are super wary of it really bothers me. I said in the middle of what you were mentioning, it's nearly impossible to get Ariel and some of the other settlements out. I said, put me in, coach. I can get him out. But that's because I have no respect for religious fundamentalists, whether it's Hamas or the Israeli settlers. I don't care about them. I think they're the ones that are causing all the problems in the first place. And so, yes, there is a way to do that. But I understand what you're saying. Israel doesn't have the political will to get those settlers out because they're maniacs and they control a big part.
But permission to just very briefly, like 15. The problem is part of that lack of a political will, and that's my whole raison d'etre, brother. That's my whole reason. There is no political will. There's no solving this conflict without solving Gaza first. Looking at what happened in Gaza, yes, it's part of the problem in Gaza. Are the Qatari suitcases full of money that Netanyahu was sending to Hamas? Yes, that was nefarious. Yes, that kept the Palestinians politically divided. However, just because Netanyahu set a trap for the Palestinians doesn't mean they should have fallen into it. Doesn't mean Hamas should have fallen into it. Unfortunately, very regrettably, you said earlier, the conversation about Israel never surrendered full sovereignty to the Palestinians. The blockade on Gaza is one of those subjects where it was imposed as a result in basically in two different tiers, if you will, in three different tiers. It started when Hamas won the elections and killed the democratic process and won it without agreeing to the condition of acknowledging Israel and renouncing violence. Then they took it a step further and they kidnapped Gilad Shalit in Gaza. And that really began the ramping up of the blockade. So both events in 2006, then the real blockade, the menacing blockade began in June of 2007, June 14th, 2007, the very day of my asylum interview in the United States, when Hamas violently took over the Gaza Strip. Now, the blockade went through different evolutions. There was a period of a couple of years where the military was calculating the number of calories you needed to keep the Palestinians alive. Then there was relaxed at some points, and then it was hardened at others. But what I'm trying to say here and communicate, part of why there wasn't sovereignty over Gaza, and this is not, God knows I'm not trying to defend Israel. I am simply trying to learn from 20 years. We're coming up on 20 years since the withdrawal of Israeli settlements, and we have nothing to show for it. Gaza's in ruins, tens of thousands of people are dead, and tens of billions of dollars have been wasted on, a war, reconstruction, war, reconstruction, war, reconstruction. I want us to learn from the past so that we don't repeat it. Okay. What I'm saying is, whether it was Israel or any other country, if you're gonna have an Islamist terrorist organization say we're gonna smuggle weapons, we're gonna build tunnels, we're gonna shoot rockets at you from this territory right next to you, and this started, by the way, before there was an Iron Dome. The Iron Dome came around in like 2012. What did Hamas expect? What did we think was going to happen to the Palestinian National Project?
Well, Ahmed, but I could reverse it on you and say, yes, but when you only give them half a sovereignty and you say the West Bank is still under full Israeli control and you'll never really get statehood and we're just gonna give you half a loaf at best, what did Israel expect? Thank you very much. Oh, we will be half your slaves? So no, Israel, the core of the cancer is the occupation. So they should let those people go, period. I know they won't, but they should. And that's definitely core of the problem. Second problem, Ahmed, is that once you have an occupation and you have an oppression like the Israelis have done to Gaza and the West Bank, you're always going to get radicals that rise up. You're never going to get a moderate government in a situation where you're deeply oppressed and etc. Right? So I wish it would. I'm in favor of moderation. I hate the violence. I hate the fundamentalism. I don't want it. I don't think it helps the Palestinians. But to say like, oh golly gee, in the middle of our 67-year or whatever we're up to now, 58-year horrific occupation of your people, you guys didn't choose moderation. Oh, color me surprised. Of course they didn't choose moderation. Okay, so, but every once in a while they do, right? So the Palestinian Authority went to the UN to ask for a state, just like Israel did. But every time that there's any kind of moderation, there was some activities near the wall a couple of years ago. That's when they killed Shireen Abu Akleh, right? An Israeli sniper shot her in the head for being a reporter. She's American. No one cared. America didn't care, etc. They assassinated a whole bunch of people near the border. The Israelis did. So whenever you do anything nonviolent, Israel calls you a terrorist anyway and murders you anyway. So when could moderation have ever worked? I want it to work, but every time the Palestinians tried, the Israelis said absolutely not. So why would it be different this time?
It can and will and has to be different because I'm not about First of all, there's something else that's been missing from this picture thus far. And I have, 10 years ago, I tried to build an internationally run, Israeli approved airfield in the Gaza Strip. And I talked to Avigdor Lieberman. I talked to Sinwar. I wrote about it in Newsweek, and Batia, our mutual friend, published it there. One of the things that I strongly believe that we as Palestinians, in pursuit of our liberation, in pursuit of our freedom, absolutely need is that we need to address the fact that the Second Intifada, and again, this is why it's so hard to have these conversations, because people want to immediately shut it down and say, you're just blaming the victims, you don't know what you're talking about, go away. The Second Intifada, the suicide bombings, Palestinian violence, for whatever psychological theory you want to use to say why it was justified or understood, not justified, you're not, no one says that, but understood and why it happened. It killed the peace movement in Israel. The rightward shift in Israeli society, the rightward shift in the electoral politics in Israel would not be what it is without all the violence associated with Hamas, with the suicide bombings, with the Second Intifada.
Yeah, I don't believe you, Ahmed. So here's why I say that. So I understand what you're saying. The violence scarred the Israeli population, and I understand why that it did. I always think show on the other foot. So I understand everything you're saying, but the West Bank didn't have Hamas, and it's not like they got freedom. They tried to go to the UN, they didn't get freedom. Literally every single thing that the Palestinians have tried, the Israelis have said no to. Whether it was violent, moderate, extreme, perfectly peaceful. So it seems like the limiting factor is obviously Israel. They're the ones doing the occupation, and they're the ones who absolutely refuse to let it go, whether you're peaceful or violent, whether you're moderate or extreme.
But Israel had an easy time arguing that it does not have a partner to negotiate with, because
that's just propaganda.
No, but Hamas gave credence to the propaganda by turning Gaza into the citadel that it did, with all the tunnels, with all the rockets, that the Israelis had all the intelligence in the world to tell them what Hamas was doing and what, but they, the whole mowing the lawn, manage the problem, all of that. So Hamas was giving credence. That's why they let Hamas, that's why the Qataris were useful idiots to Netanyahu to be able to actually allow Israel to say, look, we don't have a partner here. So just imagine, again, if we had a unified Palestinian political agenda, political program under the banner of nonviolence, saying, what if Hamas unilaterally had just said, those guns and tunnels and rockets we have, we're gonna park them away and khalas. We're gonna now be a part of the political framework and we are going to be subservient to the PLO and to the PA, and we're going to be unified in pursuing full membership at the UN, in pursuing an international peacekeeping force in the West Bank that can actually protect us from the settlers. Because it's a slippery slope. If you allow any amount of violence for the Palestinians, then where do you draw the line between terrorism or violence? Like, I'm just saying, I don't for a second believe that, unfortunately, we exhausted all the nonviolent options that could have been further bolstered had it not just been the West Bank, weak, isolated Palestinian Authority, but if it had Gaza and the West Bank under a unified body. If we went to the Arabs, I speak to Arab diplomats all the time in Washington and beyond. And Arab diplomats helped extract some of my family members. And some of the stories that I hear about what they offered the Palestinians, including those who participated in normalizing relations with Israel, including those who said to the Palestinians, listen, use us as an umbrella to try to bolster your case. Come be in our kind of like stand behind us, and we use us kind of like as the bulldozer that's going through the door. And even with Hamas overtly saying that we did October 7th in part to stop Saudi-Israeli normalization, the Saudi position right now is that there will not be any normalization as long as there is a clear pathway to Palestinian statehood. Yeah. So I'm saying that, please, my brother, do not underestimate. There's a reason why Hamas was allowed to be entrenched. Now that to be entrenched in Gaza, to develop into what it did, into what it became, once it surpassed its useful life, as Ehud Barak, as the former Israeli prime minister said, Netanyahu fed the monster and the monster backfired on him. Yeah. Now that Hamas has exhausted potentially all of its usefulness to Mr. Netanyahu, now Israel is like, okay, I think now it's time to get rid of you. And who's paying the price? The people of Gaza, which, by the way, did you notice the protests, anti-Hamas protests in Gaza over the past few days? And Hamas tortured to death Uday Nasser al-Rabi'i and executed 2 days ago 6 collaborators, which were basically people who were involved in organizing the demonstrations. Have you heard any of the pro-Palestine solidarity folks calling out Hamas? Or do Palestinian lives only matter when Israel harms them and not when a terrorist Islamist organization does? So that's what I want. I want us to be bolstered from within. I want us to clean house. I want us to not have this so liberation movements are always going to be divided amongst themselves.
But hold on.
I want us to still
hold on. So listen, look, I got to address a whole bunch of things, and then I want to get to what are we actually going to do now? So first of all, I want people to understand when I say that Israeli talking point of we don't have a partner is propaganda. In every peace deal, you make a deal with your enemy, not with your friend. So when you say we don't have a partner for peace because the other side is too mean or evil or whatever, it's just total BS propaganda. So the Palestinians could say the same thing. We don't have a partner for peace. These guys just slaughtered 15,000 of our children. They killed over 50,000 civilians. These guys are monsters. We don't have a partner for peace. Both sides can play that game, right? Second of all, no, you get to peace by getting to peace. Second of all, Hamas wasn't nice enough to Israel. Well, yes, that's true. They say, well, you didn't recognize our right to exist. But wait, Palestine doesn't exist. So Israel does exist, right? So that's total propaganda. Israelis are actually literally blocking the Palestinian right to exist while pretending that they care about right to exist. No, they only care about it for themselves. They do not care about it for the Palestinians. It's total, utter propaganda. So I don't give any credence to any of that nonsense. So the problem here is Hamas is Muslim fundamentalists. All of your complaints about Hamas I totally agree with, okay? And I'm not a fundamentalist, so I'd be on the chopping block. So I got no interest in Hamas. Now, but when I look at a situation like this, Iraq is another example. We go in, we destroy Iraq, and then the Mahdi army starts against us. And they're religious fundamentalists, they're Shia, obviously I'm against them, right? But why did the Mahdi army start? Because we invaded and we oppressed and we created a totally chaotic situation where we killed tons and tons of Iraqis, a lot of whom were innocent. So in every situation like that, what happens? Radicalism rises. Never in a situation like that does moderation rise. Oh, you just bombed the living crap out of my country and you killed, we've lost count of how many Iraqis we killed. 100,000, 600,000, over 1 million, there's varying numbers. Oh, in the middle of you slaughtering, and the other forces that came up because of the Iraq war, 600, 800,000 people, a group of moderates rose up. Has never happened. So like us getting frustrated about that and saying, hence we can't let the Palestinians have a state because, oh golly gee, as we were oppressing and killing them, radicals came up. Of course they did. That's the only option that happens in these situations. That's why you've got to get the peace. So it's backwards thinking. Like if we get rid of the radicals and we get a bunch of Palestinians who say that we love the Israelis and the Israelis are a godsend and we love them so much, we want them to exist so much that they take half our land, etc. That's not going to happen, okay? It's never going to happen. And so it's like the right of return for the Palestinians. I love you guys. I get why you want the right of return for the 1948 folks that got kicked out, etc. It was awful and terribly unfair what happened to you, but you're never gonna get a right of return because that would end Israel. Like we have to get to realistic things. So I counsel the Palestinians to be realistic, but the minute I ask the Israelis to be realistic, they're like, no way, no way. They're saying that they won't agree to our right to exist. They don't even love Jews. Really, they were gonna love Jews after this, right? I do because I have Jewish family, I have Jewish friends. I lived in a different context. But if you live in Gaza, what an insane demand that they love Israel and that they love Jews before you get to a peace deal. No, no, no. All lies, all Israeli propaganda to end any kind of peace. So now when we get to the reality of today, okay, so, but what you told me earlier really to me was actually the biggest, like the most depressing part of it, the most pessimistic part, is you said even talking about two states in Israeli circles is toxic. Then we're doomed. They're never gonna give the Palestinians a state. So look, my answer is the whole world should cut off funding to Israel because the problem is the power dynamic. It's not religion, it's not, oh, Jews or Muslims. No, in this case, Israel has the power, the Palestinians don't. The powerful always oppress. The oppressed always go to radicalism. These are all like, you could replace religions, nations, it doesn't matter, right? So in order to get to peace, my theory is you have to balance out the power a little bit. So Israel's drunk on power and we're all enabling them, and US especially, to go on a rampage and never get to the peace table. So we take away all of their funding from America, from Europe, from everywhere, do a massive boycott, divestment, and sanction campaign like South Africa until for the first time they feel the pain. And I don't mean pain in a physical way. No, I don't want any violence. Violence is an end to all of us, okay? But economic pain makes tons of sense so that you balance out the power so they have an incentive to get to the table. But if we don't do that, asking the Israelis out of the goodness of their hearts, when they're totally dead set against two-state solution right now, to give the Palestinians a state and come to the peace table with honesty and integrity, there's almost no chance of that.
So interesting you say that, because this is where I understand the limits and the challenges that folks in the land, in the West Bank, in Gaza, whether they're living in the war, under Hamas, under the military occupation, have to deal with. And that's where I look to the role of the diaspora to acknowledge that they have an oversized role in advocating pragmatic, realistic policies for on behalf of the Palestinian people in a way that can actually move the needle on this, whether it be actual policies or narratives as well that can build alliances, build bridges. One of the things that I was started to share earlier is that I strongly believe that the centrists within Israel are an immensely powerful electorate that plays an important role in swaying any outcomes and any elections. And I strongly believe, yes, I do. And that's the electorate that I have been engaging the most, center and center right, not the leftists. The leftists in Israel at the moment, and I say this as someone who's like left leaning, okay, but like this is not about me. This is independent of who I am. I am saying to you right now, brother, I have talked to thousands and thousands of people in very mainstream Jewish and Israeli audience, where at the very beginning of the talk, there's a lot of tension about having a Palestinian from Gaza who lost family members saying things in a synagogue, in a temple, in a community space. And at the very end, people are really, really engaging and react positively because they see that it is entirely possible. They understand that to this day, man, people still think everybody in Gaza supports Hamas. People think everybody in Gaza celebrated October 7th. People think everybody in Gaza knows where the hostages are. And I know that to you and I, that might sound silly, but it's an emotional subject for a lot of folks. And I view myself as a bridge builder with a lot of these constituencies. And then some of them have literally, and I've never shared this. I've raised over $350,000 last year to a major medical NGO from Jewish partners and audiences in aforementioned circles. And that basically went towards running a field hospital in Gaza by a major international medical NGO. And it was dedicated to that purpose. My point is that Israelis have this thought about the two states right now, right this very minute, not for eternity, right this minute, as being a reward for Hamas. And I'm like, whoa, let's hang on one second. Hamas doesn't believe in two states. Hamas didn't launch this to obtain two states. Hamas 1, 2, 3, 4, and folks start thinking. They start seeing things differently. Okay, but is this, how do we deal with security? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So because no one from the pro-Palestine side is talking to them. And this is where I will share with you what Realign for Palestine is trying to do is I want there to be a different realm for pro-Palestine advocacy beyond the incendiary rhetoric, the maximalist language. And yes, you might not like to hear this one, but I actually think that first of all, I don't believe that Israel is not South Africa. It's a very, very different economic dynamic, population dynamic. The whites, the Afrikaans, were a much tinier percentage of the overall population. The economic context, what South Africa needed back then to survive economically, is radically different than what Israel needs. I do not believe for a second that you can boycott or isolate Israel out of existence. What I do believe, however, and also, by the way, there's a risk with some of the BDS stuff, is that, and I came from a lot of these circles. I used to give a lot of money to these circles. And unfortunately, BDS as a strategy, people have a right to adopt that, but BDS as a cult, that's the part that I have a hard time with. To where that No Other Land movie, that film that highlighted the struggle of the occupation and of Masafer Yatta in the West Bank and won an Oscar. only to be boycotted by the BDS campaign against the will of a lot of the villagers on the ground in the land.
Yeah.
So
okay, let me jump in there. Let me jump there on
please.
that. So first of all, yeah, here we go again. So in terms of like both sides, but then who has the responsibility, right? So that Oscar-winning movie, the IDF then kidnapped the Palestinian director, beat the living crap out of him. I'm not sure we know where he is today. They might have him in a dungeon somewhere.
He was released.
Okay, all right, good. I'm glad he was released. Yeah, look, in terms of the talking to everyone, talking to the other side, talking to people, I 100% agree with you. In terms of the damage that maximalists do, I 100% agree with you. I mean, people like driving people out who believe in a two-state solution because in your fantasy land, you think you're going to get one state where the Israelis are going to agree to be outvoted. And then if somebody says two states, you try to cancel them. It's a lunatic position. Lunatic. Exactly. I'm not interested in that. So I hear what you're saying about the culture of it, et cetera. And I don't know the BDS folks at all. I don't know a single person or organizer there. So I'm not in that camp and I'm not interested in maximalism, okay? But if you say as a concept, or the Israel says as a concept, you can't do violence or terrorism against me. Okay, that makes sense, I agree, okay? You also can't do an economic boycott of me. No. Okay, then I can't do anything. Oh, okay, and you also can't go to the United Nations and ask for a state. So I can't do diplomacy, I can't do economic, I can't do violence. What can I do? You can't do anything. Okay, all right, well, so then you're not actually trying to get to peace, right? So yeah, no, I don't know anything about the organizers of it. I don't vouch for them at all. And I would never wanna boycott Israel out of existence. I don't want Israel out of existence. I want two states or two nations or whatever we're calling them, right? And I want them to be both safe and peaceful, right? I don't want anything going out of existence. But you can't, them catching feelings over boycott, divestment, and sanctions. You know why they do? Why Israel does? Because they think it might work. And so they don't want it. And that's when they get more touchy about that than they do about the violence. Like I've talked to Israelis and supporters of Israel. I've had debates with them. We talk about the violence and they're like, oh, that's terrible, et cetera. I mentioned BDS, so like, that's terrible. I'm like, well, what the hell happened, right? Oh, I see, you're worried it might work. Oh, I see, that's clear, leverage.
I'm not saying we shouldn't do none of BDS. That's not what I was saying. What I am in desperate, like on my knees, crawling and desperately looking for is what is effective, what is going to work, what is going to move the needle. And I think boycotting Kit Kat and Heinz ketchup is not going to end the settlements in the West Bank. Okay, we need to like choose our battle.
Okay, but
some of this stuff is infantilizing, brother. Some of it is just silly. Like there's a list out there. Or like the whole Starbucks thing, where Starbucks doesn't even exist in Israel. Starbucks isn't even on the ground in Israel. And there's this like cultish, like Howard, is it Schultz? I think is his name.
Schultz, yeah.
The CEO. It was like when people were like, "Yo, guys, like there's no Starbucks in Israel." He gives money to the friend. He finances the IDF. Okay, well, where does he find? Howard comes out and he's like, "No, I've never given a penny to the IDF." He stopped unions from going after.
Yeah, that has nothing to do with Israel.
Protesting for Israel.
Yeah. So listen, I totally agree with you. When they target folks like him or Jerry Seinfeld and stuff, just no. They're not Israelis. That's not. You're totally getting misdirected. I agree with you. Don't do weirdo counterproductive stuff. Definitely don't target Jewish Americans. That's nuts, right? Or Jews anywhere. But back to last thing, which is yes, but how do we push this forward? So you said, there's centrists there that you've talked. I don't think so. I think that what you're saying is there's centrists among Jewish Americans, which I totally agree with. And I think that if you had a human conversation in those synagogues, et cetera, that it would be well received. Not by everyone, but by a lot of people, because I think there are tons of Jewish Americans who are perfectly centrist. And if you just get them to a point where they don't think you're attacking them and that you hate Jews or want to destroy Israel, they'll have a great conversation with you and etc. And I think they're not really diaspora because it's a little bit apples and oranges when it comes to Israel and Jewish Americans, but that group I think can make a giant difference. And I think that's the group that we've got to really ask to push the peace process forward. But when you talk about Israel, the polling indicates that the centrists are totally defeated and the right wing is ascendant, that they have massive leads, and that nobody's sweating what they've done to Gaza. That nobody's too much. There's still a left wing, but they're a real minority.
Say, yeah, just like people regularly, Israelis and diaspora folks here refer to polling, the failed polling in Gaza and say, look, 71% of Gazans support October 7th. They're all with Hamas. And it's like, literally, this is a bad pollster that has been proven again. And he himself came and said, oh, sorry, my results were played with and were manipulated, when all the other pollsters were coming up with under less than 9%, 7 to 9% in Gaza want to see Hamas continue ruling after the end of the war. The people of Gaza are done with them. Now, Israel is a different story in terms of polling, but I talk to these, our definition of center here is radically different than what constitutes center over there. But before that, brother, in addition to talking to that audience, I'm looking at my community, Arab Americans, Palestinian Americans, the diaspora community that has an oversized role. And I want us to, what I'm desperate to see is to actually, I am basically one of two Palestinian Americans in Washington, D.C., who are working at think tanks and presenting Palestinian think tanks. Palestinians don't invest in think tanks. Arabs or Palestinians or many Muslim Americans with a focus on Palestine, they don't think about mainstream think tanks. They don't think about building fellowships. They don't think about building the next cadre of young, men and women who can go to Washington, who can work on Capitol Hill, who can I'm tired of people complaining about AIPAC without understanding. Have you actually ever met with an AIPAC person and understood how they actually work? Have you actually understood the numbers and understood their 501c3 versus their 501c4 operations? Have you actually understood how the system works? If you actually want to do something other than complain about it, that's where my headspace is at. That's number one. Number two is college activism. The Realign for Palestine. One of the things that I aspire to do is a lot of these students, they mean well, but this cosplaying, putting on a keffiyeh and balaclavas and playing your Senoir or green headbands, that's really unhelpful. That gives a bad name to the Palestinian people. And unfortunately, they're saying that they're out in the open saying that we're not here to look to be acceptable. We're not here to be presentable. We're here to be rough on the edges. We're here. So we unfortunately, if you look at the Jewish students, you have anywhere from the J Street to the Israel Policy Forums to the ADL or the AJC or the AIPAC here or many things in between or the Hillels. If you're pro-Palestine, you have nothing. You have Students for Justice in Palestine, which they're really not for justice. They've evolved to become pro-Hamas overtly. This is not me hyperbole. Overtly pro-Hamas, pro the armed resistance, all means necessary. They say we don't want no two-state. We want 1948. We don't believe in two states. We don't, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And so, unfortunately, we can do better. We have smart, intelligent people.
So Ahmed, last thing here. So I hear you, and all the things you describe are definitely counterproductive. And it drives me crazy, like when people in one of the protests in Washington, they burned an American flag. You couldn't hurt the Palestinian cause anymore if you tried. I mean, like that's so counterproductive that it made me wonder if it was a false flag operation. That's how counterproductive it is, right? Writing Hamas on a statue in Washington is super counterproductive. And so if you want to help the Palestinian people, do not present an extremist case that is easy to dismiss, which will then keep them in servitude for longer and longer and longer, and oppression, etc. Okay, so total agreement there. So the last thing I want to try is, all right, what if the Palestinian movement, if you Realign for Palestine or others could convince everybody, the diaspora, everyone, okay, diplomatic route. No call for violence, no supporting Hamas, no nothing. Diplomatic route, go to the UN, get a Palestinian state just like Israel got a Palestinian state. Now, my guess is that the Israelis would despise that, okay? And they'd probably fight you harder than they fight those students who are actually somewhat helping them. So can we do that? Or is there any problem with that?
We can absolutely do it, but this is where I'm telling you, there's a hunger among many, even, by the way, that going back to the center and center-right electorate within Israel, one of the things that I found most fascinating about them is that they're not motivated by the idealism of the leftists or the peace movement within Israel, the tiny peace movement in Israel, or the like nihilism or messianic tendencies of the far right or the insane right-wing folks, the settlers and the Ben-Gvirs and the Smotriches and the fascists of the world. So the folks in the middle can absolutely be allies. We need allies inside Israel beyond the leftists, beyond the wonderful friends that I have in standing together, in breaking the silence, in the like women wage peace or women of the sun, women wage peace, all the usual suspects that are part of the peace movement within Israel. You need 50x that, and the only way to do it is to arouse the self-interest out of Israelis to realize, listen, guys, you want integration into the Arab world, you want safety and security and acknowledgement first and foremost. Because the Israelis want to be they're a part, and half of Jewish Israelis, by the way, they're Mizrahi Jews. They're from the Middle East. So they want to feel a part of this region. And because of the conflict, they can't. So I strongly believe that out of a self-interest, and some of them might just be wonderful allies, like out of principle, they will join us in the diplomatic route. Now before we get there, we need to define, for example, to this day, do you know that there's no uniform definition for what constitutes an occupation? To me, it's the military occupation of the West Bank. For some, it's the mere existence of Israel. That's occupation. We need to address that. We need to understand that there is not going to be the right of return of millions of descendants of refugees from 48. My grandparents were pushed out in 1948. On both sides. I get it. Wallah, I get it. I grew up in the UNRWA system, but that's not going to happen. We need to understand that Jerusalem is going to be shared. That eventually the space might entail something malleable border-wise, where Israelis come and go and Palestinians come and go. So are we comfortable with those definitions? Once we clean house, once we have some strategy, once we have a big tent and a big umbrella that includes far more than just the Palestinian Authority and their people, then I strongly believe we're bulletproof. We've become fail-safe, if you will, and then we can't be accused of anti-Semitism, which by the way,
you'll get accused of it anyway.
No. But I want to one last thing. I swear, one last thing. And then And then that's all I have to say. It is a fact that you get there are superfluous accusations of anti-Semitism, but it is also a fact that since October 7th, the line between anti-Israel or anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism has unfortunately been blurred or crossed regularly. And that has also been alarming. I'm not saying in every single case and every single occasion, but this is where we need the leadership of a lot of the groups, of the movement, of the solidarity organizations to define that for our youth, for the students, for the activists.
Yeah, I hear you. And look, I agree and disagree. So the part I agree with is, look, I'm a moderate. So to me on this issue, if such a thing exists. So what that means to me is, yes, I don't even like using the word Zionism. I never say somebody's a Zionist, right? When you say it blurs the lines, I agree with you and it bothers me. And I hate anti-Semitism. I don't want any of it. It's all it is counterproductive. It's immoral. It's not the right thing, et cetera, et cetera. So those are clear to me and obvious. But I do think that if you cleaned up all the anti-Semitism in the world and you came up with a diplomatic solution and united all the Palestinians, these are all very, very hard tasks, enormously hard tasks. If you did all that, they would come up with a new excuse and they would say, no, you looked at me kind of funny, anti-Semitism, right? Because at the end of the day, both the Israeli government and the Israeli electorate do not want peace. They want to take more land. That's just a fact, okay? And it's a fact based on the polling, it's a fact based on the elections. They don't want peace. We have to make them want peace, not through violence, but through leverage, power, et cetera. It doesn't help to be anti-Semitic, that takes away your leverage. It doesn't help to be extremist or maximalist, it takes away your leverage and your power. But ultimately, Ahmed, if we have a disagreement, it's on this. The responsibility doesn't lie with the Palestinians. I would ask them to do the right thing anyway. But the responsibility, much more so, the responsibility lies on all sides, of course, as a general thing. But who has the bigger responsibility? It's the people with power. It's the people doing the occupation. It's the people doing the oppression. It's the people that have slaughtered over 50,000 people and 15,000 children that are currently stealing more land in Gaza. And yes, they are stealing it. That's exactly what's happening. And they've stolen more and more land in the West Bank. I know stealing triggers people, right? But I partly want to trigger them, not because I hate them, because I want them to understand there is no like happy, like, oh golly gee, the Palestinians would get along with you, great. If you take more of their land and if you bomb them more and you kill more of their children, at some point they'll love you. No, they won't. No, they won't. And if the responsibility is of Israel, they're the powerful, they're the Goliaths. They're the ones with the bigger military than the rest of the Middle East combined. They're the one with America behind their, in their corner. They're the one with Iron Dome. They're the one with nukes. So they're the one with the responsibility. Stop oppressing these people, stop occupying these people. But the problem is the onus is never put on Israel or the Israeli supporters. It's always, well, the Palestinians, if you love the Jews more, you love the Israelis more, you love the Zionists more, you love this more, you love that more, you're more moderate, more moderate, more moderate. Nope, nope, nope. And every time Lucy finds a way to take that football away right before Charlie kicks the ball. So let me just ask it in the form of a question, then I promise everyone, including the audience, that we'll go. That isn't the bigger responsibility on Israel and Israeli supporters to go towards moderation, to go towards ending the oppression and the occupation, and to actually do all the things that they want the Palestinians to do it 10 times more on their own side, since they are the occupying imperial power?
I think broadly speaking, yes, absolutely, Israel bears tremendous responsibility. I mean, after all, Israel is the one with all the control and the dominion over the lives of the Palestinian people. However, there has been a chronic abdication of responsibility, of agency, of accountability on the Palestinian side. And that has been taught, passed down, and propagated by Western audiences as well. And that's extraordinarily dangerous and unhelpful. My family would still be alive, and so would 50,000 other Gazans, if Hamas had simply kept its soldiers at home on October 7th.
I actually don't believe that. I actually don't believe that at all.
How could you not?
Yeah, because Israel was going to try to take Gaza. Ben Gvir, Smotrich, and Netanyahu have a plan for greater Israel. They needed an excuse to go grab more land in Gaza. And golly gee, the greatest intelligence agency in the world missed this gigantic incursion by Hamas, which now the Israeli press has reported they didn't miss it at all. They knew it was coming. So what part of that? No, they would have slaughtered, they would have found an excuse to start that war and to slaughter those people and drive them out no matter what. That's not on all Israelis. Most Israelis have no idea about that, don't know that, or don't believe that. But it is their awful terrorist government. And so they would have tried to take Gaza one way or another under this current Israeli government. No question about it. So, and by the way, the West Bank didn't do anything, and they're taking more of the West Bank right now. And they're slaughtering innocent civilians in the West Bank right now. So look, no, I'm whatever you think, God bless you, brother, and I agree with a ton of what you're saying, okay? But my point here is, if anybody's watched or listened to this, please go talk to people who support Israel and explain to them, it is not the powerless that have the power, it is the powerful that have the power. Okay, and we're not talking about Jews versus Muslims. We're talking about Israel, a government. That government has enormous power, and they are the ones doing the occupation. They are not David, they are Goliath, and they are crushing the Palestinian people in Gaza right now. So, and you know why that could work? If you have a conversation with them and you're not like aggressive and you hate them and you don't want them to exist. No. Ask them to be moral, to find their moral core, because I'm positive they have it. I actually believe in supporters of Israel. I believe that they have, I know them. They have a moral core, and they've been taught that through the culture of Judaism. And the culture of Judaism is a positive and wonderful force. But they've got to find that moral core and that moral center. Until they do that and start viewing the Palestinians as fellow human beings, until they stop tolerating what their government is doing to the Palestinians in ways they would never, ever tolerate them doing to Jews. If this government was doing, or any government was doing what Israel is doing to the Palestinians to Jewish people, every single Israeli supporter would despise that government and would spend all of their energy trying to take down that government and replace it with a more moderate government. I'm asking all supporters of Israel to do that with your own government, or whether it's your government or a government you're allied with. If you're not asking for moderation out of Israel, then you're saying, I like oppressing them, I like occupying them, and I'm gonna do it for another 57 years, and then I'll pretend it's the Palestinians' fault, and I'll shame them and go, you didn't do all my demands and you didn't love me enough. No, that's nothing but excuses. So whether you're on either side, but especially the side of the powerful, look internally, look in the mirror, look to find your moral core that I'm positive that exists, and actually try to treat the other side as you would want to be treated. I could solve the whole thing if I could just get into the heads of Israelis and Palestinians and say, treat the other side as if they are you. If I could switch that button, this problem would be over in a second, in a minute, because the Palestinians would never do that to each other, and the Israelis would never, ever, ever allow it to happen to Israelis or Jews. But if it's Palestinians, they're like, yeah, human shields, whatever. They don't love us enough. They have a charter somewhere, whatever. Just keep slaughtering their children. It's fine. It's not fine. It's not fine, and you know it. I don't mean Ahmed. I mean, if you're listening and you support Israel, you know it's not fine. Unfortunately, I have terrible news for you, but you've become the bad guys. You're the villain in the movie. And I'll get yelled at from both sides, Ahmed, as you do, which is, I don't think they are the villain. I think they can snap out of it. I think they have the good guy inside them. They've just chosen the villain role and they don't even know it. So you're trying to organize Palestinians to wake up and go towards moderation, which has a better chance of success. And God bless you, brother, and good luck to you, okay? And what I'm trying to do, and what I'm trying to do is tell supporters of Israel, you gotta wake up. Until you wake up, We're never gonna get to a solution because you're holding all the power.
Well, absolutely, man. Thanks again for having me. If folks are interested, realignforpalestine.org. Thank you.
Thank you, Ahmed Fouad Alkhatib. We appreciate you, brother.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
You too.